secrecy, lust, love, scandal, and intergenerational change. Man Booker Prize-winning author Alan Hollinghurst explores how a father's secrets from the past can impact the life of a son in the Sparsholt Affair. It's his sixth novel, and we're very pleased that it brings Alan Hollinghurst to our studio tonight. It's nice to meet you.
And you.
So this novel is mostly about the relationship of fathers and sons. Did you base the character of David, who did you base that on?
I didn't base it on anyone in particular, I think.
Was it the men of that generation? Because Johnny is from your generation, right?
Johnny is more or less the same age as me, yes. He's a couple of years older, I think. I suppose I grew up very much in a world which was coloured by the war. You know, I was born in 1954, only just after rationing had ended in England. My father had been in the RAF, my mother had been in the army. I was surrounded by their friends, most of whom still use their sort of wartime titles. So as a polite little boy, I addressed people as Major Smith and Wing Commander so-and-so. You know, it's hard to remember now, in a way, how permeated by the war that period in English life was. So I think the idea of these people to whom the experience of the war had been this transformative thing, really.
Is that why you worried about the war?
It wasn't hard for me to sort of imagine a figure like that, who's an ambitious young man who knows as soon as the war starts that he wants to be a pilot.
And what's the relationship like between Johnny and David?
Well, I think it's always quite a difficult one, because David is a very masculine, driven, determined character. He's someone who's got his life mapped out in advance, and he pretty well achieves everything that he sets out to get, until everything goes horribly wrong. Johnny is much more sensitive. He has a lot of his more artistic mother in him. And he's someone who, I think, as a boy, reveres his father, but is frightened of him. And when we see him as a 14-year-old, and his father's this magnificent and by then rather famous figure, and a very successful businessman. And I do think there's very much sort of intimacy in their relations with each other.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because you would think, I don't want to give away too many surprises in the book, because there's a lot of surprises.
It's a difficult book to talk about
without giving out the big story. But you would think that they would be closer than they are. Why do you think they're not as close as they should be? Because Johnny ends up finding like a father figure in one of David's friends.
I think, again, I think it was perhaps something of that generation. And I love my father dearly, but we never had any sort of intimate conversation, and a certain remoteness in the father figure and a compensatory closeness to the mother, I think, was very typical of men of that generation, who'd perhaps reinforced by their being in the services in the war, a sort of heightened masculinity and never crying, I mean, my father never wore a wedding ring, because he thought rings were, I mean, even though
too limiting,
he thought they were rather pansy. So there's that, I think, it's quite a deep thing in the British mentality, this sort of emotional reserve and difficulty with expressing your feelings. I think one thing that happens as the book goes on through later decades is that people are more and more able to express themselves.
Well, that's the thing. So as we move on through the book is separated into 5 parts. There's more freedom, and I wonder if David has a little bit of resentment towards Johnny because of that.
Well, I think he probably does. I mean, there's so much about David the father that we never really know, because none of the book is seen from his point of view. And there's a scene, as you know, sort of latish on in the book, where his father comes to London and they have their ritual dinner at his luncheon at his club, the RAF club. And Johnny sort of knows in advance that it's not really going to go very well, but he goes through the thing with sort of faint optimism that there might be a sort of breakthrough. Johnny, by this time, is a successful portrait painter, and there's this strange subject in the air that he's never painted his father, and he suggests it, but the father, he's sort of rather thrown by the idea. I mean, he's obviously pleased by it in a sense, but he also sees it as a kind of threat. And then they'd have to spend days together.
And at this point, too, I think we know that Johnny is gay, right?
We certainly know that Johnny is gay, and you know, David sees Johnny leading a life which not only did he not lead himself, but it's clear that in this affair, the scandal which changes his life, his own gayness has been very publicly sort of punished and stigmatized.
To go back to your father, when you came out, there's such a lovely story about how you came out to your father, even if you do call it, I don't know, would you call it coming out?
It wasn't even quite coming out, no. It was more him sort of going in, I think. I mean, yes, we were just together in the car one day, and he just said, "Got any particular girlfriends at the moment, old boy?" And I said, "No, Dad, I haven't." And he said, "You're not really interested, are you?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm not." He said, "No, I didn't think so." And that was it, you know. And
did you ever talk about it?
No. We did a little bit after my first book came out, which was sort of very in your face, you know. So it became an unignorable topic then. But it wasn't something which I mean, it was sort of absorbed, but actually we didn't talk about it very much. It's probably another instance of this thing I've already been touching on, you know, the British reluctance to kind of expose your feelings. And so a great deal going unsaid, which I think is something that's always fascinated me in writing about English life, you know, all the things that are not said.
Why is that interesting to you?
Well, it's a rich field for the novelist who's interested in depicting how people interact and how the things that they're not saying or that they're giving away about their feelings without sort of quite coming out with them. The whole world of sort of hidden motives in conversation. And I think, you know, obviously if you're writing about gay life in earlier periods when there were all sorts of things couldn't be said explicitly, it becomes rather fascinating.
I would like to ask you if you could read from your book, please.
Yes.
And here you go. And I've just marked it from there to here.
And the fact was that he had been in touch as lately as 7 or 8 years ago. At the time of the crisis, the Sparsholt Affair, he had written Drum a letter of wary and perhaps rather futile support. And a few days later, a policeman had come round to have a word with him about it. What had he known about David Sparsholt's private life? How well did he know him himself? Had there ever been any suggestion of impropriety on Mr. Sparsholt's part towards him? Absolutely not, said Everett, frightened by the question, but amused by the private perspective in which he saw the answer, as if naked figures were holding their breath behind the curtains or crouched under the desk. We knew each other slightly at Oxford. Not sure these days if this mere fact would deflect suspicion. But of course we were both called up almost at once, which he thought had a better chance. One knew about his marvellous war, squadron leader at 22, wasn't it? The DFC? Perhaps this was overdoing it, but the policeman paused respectfully. I simply felt sorry for him. I imagine anyone would.
So we hear, thank you so much, that was a pleasure. So we hear that there's a scandal, a crisis, but you never actually say what happened. And that situation actually has ripple effects for a lot of the characters, especially Johnny. Why not just talk about it directly, about the affair?
I think I always felt a certain reluctance to go into the whole sort of squalid details of the affair. And what I was much more interested in was the kind of before and after of it. And seeing David Sparsholt himself, first of all as a 17-year-old and then as a sort of successful, but as we've been saying, rather distant father figure. And in the background of the second part of the book, this sort of crisis which is going to break and disrupt all their lives is building. Their young 14-year-old Johnny is not aware of it, but the reader will be picking up the hints. And then when we rejoin the narrative, and that period, 1974, that I read that extract from, it's already 8 years after this scandal has happened, and we see it impacting on the life of Johnny, who, of course, bears this unusual name, and he's now 22, he's come to London, he's determined to live a sort of life as a gay man, and finding his way into, as I think you said earlier, into a sort of alternative family, a kind of gay household. And the fact of his father having been involved in a scandal which has various elements, we've realised. There's some sort of business corruption thing. He's been involved in some sort of planning scam, but there's also been this sort of gay sexual element to it. David Sparsholt is someone who can use his rather pliable sexuality to get his own way, as we've seen in the first part of the book. And this creates a rather difficult kind of atmosphere for Johnny sort of trying to be himself, I think. It means that wherever he goes, people hear his name and think, oh yes, they do a little double take. He must be son of that notorious figure. To some people, of course, it adds a certain glamour to him. Yes, I wanted to create that strange atmosphere of the sort of the lingering stain of a scandal, and how in the public mind, which will mainly have been excited by kind of prurient details in the press and so on at the time, it sort of fades, and it's something uncomfortable. You can't quite remember what the details of
Memory
it
does
were.
that to you, right?
Yes.
Did you base it on a real scandal?
Not precisely, no. I mean, we seem to have quite a lot of scandals in those days. I mean, the hugest affair, and something on a much bigger scale than the Sparsholt Affair, was the Profumo Affair. And David Profumo, Jack Profumo's son, wrote a very good book about it, called Bringing the House Down, where he did the complicated thing of painting very subtle portraits of both his parents and of their marriage, and then of this crisis breaking when he was still a schoolboy. And that did sort of, I mean, I read that before I wrote this book, and he knowing nothing about it really, but being taken away from school, not allowed to see the papers and so on, not knowing what was going on as his whole world was being turned upside down.
So what drew you to that? Was it the affair, the scandal, or
it was just, yes, the idea of the impact of a scandal. And I think because, so much of gay life in the past, when it became visible, was by means of a scandal. Gay life was illegal, and so if it sort of became exposed, it was likely to be in the glare of a scandal.
And if it happened now, it would be...
No. So it was... so I think I had a sense of that sort of combustible nature of the danger of gay life in the past, and I wanted to sort of capture it erupting in a scandal at just that moment. But as I say, I didn't really want to go... And a lot of the way this book works, I think, is by inviting the reader to speculate about what's happened in the often quite big gaps in the narrative.
Well, homosexuality was decriminalized in the United Kingdom in 1967.
Yes.
And one of the sections of the book is 1966, and this is around the time that Johnny comes of age. Did you identify with his character during that time?
I mean, at the period. Well, I mean, I was 13 when the Sexual Offences Bill was going through Parliament. I can remember the headlines in my parents' newspapers, and knowing already at that age that homosexuality was something of considerable interest to me, and therefore not asking anything about it at all.
So you knew at that time, by that age, that you were gay?
I think so, and I was certainly, living in a boys' boarding school, I was sort of boning up on it like mad. I was too young, obviously, to really take in what was going on at the level of legislation. And it's, of course, it was a very significant event, I think, in our sort of social history. And last year we had a lot of, what's the right word? Not entirely celebrations of the half century of this having happened, because it was only a partial thing, and it decriminalised homosexual acts between two men over 21 in private. And it was very interesting looking at the history of the period to see how in the immediate wake of the passing of the bill, there was a huge increase in police prosecutions of gay men on other sort of offences.
And there were gay clubs, but you had to have food or eat at the clubs or something?
Well, I mean, before that, gay clubs couldn't be identified as such at all. Of course, afterwards they could. Yes, and I have a scene in the 1974 section of the book, which is from a period which I encountered the sort of tail end of when I was making my own first rather worried sort of sorties onto the gay scene in the late 70s. Yes, there were very complex sort of licensing laws around clubs, and if a gay club wanted to stay open after 11 o'clock and have dancing, then they had to serve food. So there was this extraordinary thing when you went out to a gay club that everybody was given a bowl of salad, which was really the last thing you wanted. And towards the end of a rather riotous evening, the whole place had been littered with little bits of lettuce. And, so, and that was such a strange period detail that I couldn't resist putting it into the book. But the fact is, of course, you have an important change of the law of this kind, and there's a resistance to it, as I was saying, in that sort of striking police arrest figures and so on. But the actual cultural, social changes that it enables are much slower to happen. So there, we're sort of 7 years after the act has happened. But these changes, the change in the law is of fundamental importance in enabling these things, but they don't happen at once. And I felt that very, very much in my own sort of late adolescence and as a student when I decided I would write about this thing no one had actually written about. It was, when I was doing my sort of graduate thesis about...
You wrote a thesis at Oxford,
yes,
Oxford University, right?
About gay writers like E.M. Forster and so on, asking what role their homosexuality played in their creative lives, this essential thing about them which they couldn't write about openly, and about the ways in which actually it might have been the repression might have been useful, and the other ways in which they did give hints about it to the knowing. But, Forster had only died in 1970, and up to that point no one had publicly said that he was gay, and he certainly hadn't. Now it's absolutely axiomatic to our understanding of Forster that he was gay. So there's been a huge sort of change in understanding of the whole question. And
why were you drawn to that? I mean, you were at Oxford. This was in the 70s, right?
Yes.
How were you drawn to that subject?
I think because of my own gayness, and looking around and sort of thinking, well, what was there really? Anything that had happened was happening in this sort of covert way, and unless it was pornography. The main ways you could read about gay life was either in medical or psychiatric literature or in pornography. And I think it seemed to me when I later came to write my own first novel that there might be some way one could do better than that. One could write about gay life as sort of naturally and unapologetically as a sort of straight writer would write about heterosexual life. But this hadn't really happened before, and that my first book came out in 21 years after that. So one sees how comparatively slow these changes are. They're sort of expanding into new freedoms. That doesn't happen at once.
Well, this is what the NPR had to say about your writing. Ever since his 1988 debut, The Swimming Pool Library, this gifted English novelist has been an unsurpassed chronicler of worldly gay lives. Yet, to label him a great gay writer is diminishing, like calling Philip Roth a great Jewish writer or Toni Morrison a great African-American woman writer. As with them, his talent is so big it explodes the category.
Wow.
I mean, I thought it was a great quote because you've been celebrated for, creating characters and showing gay life at a time when, again, like you said, it was either in pornography or psychiatric books. But do you like being called a great gay writer?
Well, one never minds being called a great writer of any kind, but yeah, I mean, I identify myself as a gay writer very much at the beginning, and that was part of the whole interest and novelty and excitement of it. I think the world into which this new novel is emerging is very different from the one in which my first book appeared exactly 30 years ago. And the question of my gayness is sort of somehow much less important. I also think that gay writing sort of rose in prominence in response to the various challenges. Well, first of all to sort of liberation, and then to the great crisis of AIDS, and it had a sort of urgency about it, which in our culture at least it's rather lost now with all the larger social changes that have gone on. So it doesn't, I think I will always be interested in writing about gay lives, but the actual nature of the subject has changed over those 30 years. And so it doesn't seem to be so significant now to me. And
the idea is to sell as many books as possible, right?
Yeah, I mean, I there was something sort of quite programmatically sort of gay about my first book, certainly. But now, it's just the position that I write from,
but I think
I don't think of it as being in a special sort of category.
But I think you've had great influence on other people who were gay, reading your books and showing that you didn't have to live in the shadows and you can actually celebrate your life. And I think that's very important.
Well,
to
it would be nice to think that. Yes,
yeah. I wanted to go back to the book for a second. Of the gay men in the novel you met at Oxford during the war, some went on to live what appeared to be so-called straight lives with wives and children. Was that the case for many men during that era?
Well, I think it often was, wasn't it? And I mean, again, it's sort of getting away from the sort of the gay category. I think I felt more and more interested in writing about sort of, bisexuality, or that strange, perhaps slightly compromised way in which a lot of men who knew they were fundamentally gay found that they were able to get married and have children and sort of pass as straight, as it were. And quite often you find people of that generation, after their children have grown up, sort of coming out and abandoning their marriages and responding in a way that David Sparsholt doesn't in the book, responding to these new freedoms at last.
So does he consider himself to be homosexual?
I don't think he does, really, no. And it is, it's ambiguous, isn't it? He has married and had a child, and he's married again after his wife divorces him after the scandal. And I think he is someone I think who will be very unhappy with that. He might secretly yearn for it, but I think he would be unhappy with it as a label.
Well, I think what was one of the things that I found interesting was at the very beginning of the book, you describe when he gets noticed and he's in a frame and people are looking at his body, and then towards the end, it's become technology, like it's a computer and you're looking at people, their bodies, and this is how you meet people online, decide, I want that. But it's just kind of like, again, it's like a frame of a person's body. Yeah. Was that intentional?
Yes, very much so, yes. And one of the nice things you can do with writing across this sort of span, particularly if you leave out a lot, so you just juxtapose one period with another without the kind of narrative tissue in between, is that you can contrast these things. And I hope the reader keeps a sense, may only be a sort of subliminal sense of these kind of motifs going through the book. And as you say, yes, David Sparshot's first seen exercising through a sort of brightly lit window at dusk. And then, yes, people are looking into the windows of their iPhones or their laptops. And it's, yes, the idea of the desirable object. And of course, there's a drawing done of David, a headless drawing of him in the nude, done when he's 17, which sort of survives through into the 21st century without anybody quite knowing who it is.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess.
Exactly.
You've said that writing each book that you write, it becomes harder to write the next. What do you mean by that?
I guess I mean various things. One is the fear of repeating myself. One is the setting of new kind of technical challenges, things which might preoccupy me a great deal but might not register particularly with the reader. And the other is adjusting to the changes which happen in your own life and mind as you get older. It's not a question of, as it were, running out of material. And in fact, the older I get, the more superabundant the possible material comes to be. And I think one reason I've now written 2 books which cover these such wide time spans is I haven't been able quite to decide which of those stories to write. So I write these rather sort of complicated books which have a number of different narratives in them. And I'm attracted by that idea of the person, the reader's not quite knowing whose story it is. And it's starting out seeming to be one person's narrative, but as time goes by, inevitably the story is taken over, sort of like a relay race by somebody else. So, and I think there's probably some sort of, I don't have the same creative energy that I used to have. But that's not necessarily a handicap. It just means one writes in a different way. But I do find it more effortful, and the sheer sort of joy, almost sort of ecstatic happiness of writing I used to feel when I was young. I don't get so often now, I'm afraid.
And speaking of age, are you thinking about
retiring?
Getting older. I mean, no, you can write now. With technology, you can do it. Well, we want you to keep writing, but is that something that you're thinking about, getting older?
Well, one does think about it, and it's become more and more the subject of my books, I think. And it's a very interesting subject. I mean, I've always been interested in writing about relationships between generations, and the way the young learn from the old. And I think this happens more explicitly in this book, where indeed there are two sort of cross-generational romantic relationships, one between a young man in his early 20s and a man in his 50s. And at the end of the book, that's sort of reversed, and the 60-year-old man finds himself the subject of affection of a man half his age. And wish fulfillment, no doubt. But I am, and the passage of time inevitably becomes more interesting to you as you get older, and indeed the effects of time on memory, and how we misremember the past or select from the past. I mean, the first section of this novel, the reader discovers when they finish it, is actually a memoir written up 30 years later, and doubtless very speculative in a lot of its details.
Oh, wow. Alan, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I wish we had another 30 minutes to talk.
Oh, well, thank you.
Fantastic book. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.